Section 19 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 10, Commerce and Trade, Part 1. The earliest trade recorded as carried on in the British Isles consisted of the exchange of tin with the Gauls, and perhaps also with Phoenician traders. Under Roman rule, the agricultural and mineral resources of Britain were more fully developed. Julius Caesar praised the Southdown mutton, and Rome was supplied with oysters which came from Whitstable and Reculvers, Regulbium, and were carried through the river Stour, forming the western boundary of the island of Thanet, and were exported from Richborough, Rutupiae. Corn was exported in large quantities, and Londinium, the principal port for trading with Gaul, was the centre of commerce. There is no notice of commerce during the early Anglo-Saxon period, but Bede, at the beginning of the 8th century, speaks of London as a great market which traders frequented by land or sea. The letter of protection for English pilgrims given to Offa of Mercia by Charlemagne, AD 796, which refers to trade carried on by them, has been called, quote, the first English commercial treaty, end quote. One remarkable fact is that this commerce was mainly in the hands of foreigners. London in the early times was mainly a city of foreigners. Hence the jealousy of the natives, which grew in strength as time went on. Commerce greatly increased during the reign of Edgar, so that Ethelred, his son, deemed it time to draw up a code of laws to regulate the customs to be paid by the merchants of France and Flanders, as well as by the emperor's men. But the promulgation of the laws of Athelstan, AD 925 to 929, which ordained that a merchant who had made 3 sea voyages should be of right a thane, is proof of the small number as well as of the importance of such native traders. We learn from the colloquies of the Abbot Elfric, 11th century, that most of the commodities imported into England were articles of luxury. The port of Dowgate was granted to the city of Rouen as early as Edward the Confessor's reign, and the right was afterwards confirmed. The Confessor also gave a portion of Weremanny Acre within London, quote, with the wharf belonging to it, and with its market rights and places for merchandise, its stalls and shops, its rents and dues and rights, its toll and wharfage, end quote, to St. Peter's at Ghent, which grant was confirmed by William I, 1081. After the conquest, communication with Normandy naturally increased greatly. Rouen was particularly favoured, and was granted a monopoly of trade with Ireland and freedom of commerce in London. In the 12th century, silver was imported in exchange for meat, fish, and wool, which were all sent to the manufacturing districts of the Low Countries. Corn was sometimes exported, but not without a license. The House or Guild of the Merchants of Almaine, otherwise called the House of the Teutonics, was formed about the year 1169, though the Germans, under the name of Easterlings, are known to have traded here during the Saxon period. The guild flourished in London as the merchants of the Steelyard till the time of Elizabeth, when their special privileges were abolished by royal decree. Hallam tells us that from the middle of the 12th to the 13th century, the traders of England became more and more prosperous. The towns on the southern coast exported tin and other metals in exchange for the wines of France. Those on the eastern coast sent corn to Norway, and the Cinque Ports bartered wool against the stuffs of Flanders. The export of wool and the import of cloth were prohibited in 1261, and the prohibition was repeated in 1271. The cause of this prohibition may be illustrated by reference to a particular import, woad, which seems to show that a native woolen manufacture existed, although all the finer cloth came from Flanders. The restrictions originally imposed upon the woad merchants would not allow them a settlement in the city, nor permit them to store their woad, which they had to sell as best they could on the wharf where it was landed. In 1237, however, the merchants of Amiens, Corbie, and Nesle were allowed, by special arrangement, greater freedom in the disposal of their woad and other wares. In the end, the woad merchants settled in Cannon Street, Candlewick Street, the very centre of the cloth trade in London, as Lydgate tells us in his London Lickpenny. Quote, "Then I went forth by London Stone, throughout all Canwick Street. Drapers much cloth offered me anon." End quote. Footnote: no woolen cloth was allowed to be dyed black except with woad. The whole history of the cultivation and use of woad is one of great interest. It was cultivated in England from the earliest times, and the trade was ruined by the indigo growers, as they in turn have been ruined in our own day by the manufacture in Germany of synthetic indigo. End of footnote. London was the seat of trade in Eastern luxuries, which became known largely through the influence of the Crusades. Silks, fruits, spices, and Greek wines were brought here by the Italian fleet which, after 1317, regularly visited England. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the importance of our commerce is shown by the appearance of regulations for its promotion in the Statute Book. The Statute of Merchants is dated 1283 to 1285, and the Carta Mercatoria 1303. The trade with Bordeaux was very active, and largely carried on by English ships from London, Bristol, Dover, and Hull. Wool, herrings, lead, copper and tin were taken out in these ships, also pilgrims as passengers. The ships returned to England laden with wine and corn when the home production was short. In 1350, 141 ships carried 13,429 tons of wine from Bordeaux to England. English merchants travelled largely and made their appearance at the great continental fairs. As commerce increased, the enemies of commerce also increased, and we find therefore that the Thames and the open sea were infested by bands of pirates. Soon after pirates had made a successful descent upon Scarborough, John Philpot, a prominent Londoner, set himself to break up the conspiracy. He fitted out a fleet at his own expense and, putting to sea, succeeded in capturing the ringleader, a feat which rendered him so popular as to excite the jealousy of the Duke of Lancaster and other nobles. His fellow citizens showed their appreciation of his character by electing him to succeed Brember in the mayoralty in October 1387. How serious this danger really was may be seen from the fact that not even the king was safe. When Henry IV, in order to escape the pestilence raging in London, crossed from Queensborough in Sheppey to Lee in Essex, on his way to Plashy, though convoyed by Lord Camoys with certain ships of war, narrowly escaped capture by pirates. A vessel containing part of his baggage and retinue, together with his vice-chamberlain, fell into the hands of the enemy. This scandal naturally created a great stir, and Lord Camoys was tried on a charge of correspondence with the enemy. He was acquitted, but his innocence appears to have been considered doubtful. Pirates lurked in the Thames or blockaded the mouth of the river, and to prevent them from landing within the area of the city, the streets leading to the river were defended by chains. Still further to defend London from privateers, John Philpot offered to build, at his own cost, a stone tower 60 king's feet in height near Ratcliffe, provided the Corporation of London would levy 6pence in the pound on the rental of the city and build a corresponding tower on the opposite side of the river, so that an iron chain might be stretched from one tower to the other to protect the shipping of the river from night attack. The danger was so imminent that the Common Council agreed to the proposal, but, as the alarm died away, this scheme of defence was laid aside. In 1370, quote, "the mayor, aldermen, and commonalty were given to understand that certain galleys, with a multitude of armed men therein, were lying off the foreland of Thanet, end quote. And it was therefore ordered that, quote, every night watch shall be kept between the Tower of London and Billingsgate, with 40 men-at-arms and 60 archers, end quote. Which watch the men of the trades underwritten, quote, agreed to keep in succession each night in the form as follows: on Tuesday, the drapers and the tailors; on Wednesday, the mercers and the apothecaries; on Thursday, the fishmongers and the butchers. On Friday, the pewterers and the vintners. On Saturday, the goldsmiths and the saddlers. On Sunday, the ironmongers, the armourers and the cutlers. On Monday, the taurers, couriers, the spurriers, the bowyers, and the girdlers." End quote. These pirates gave a great deal of trouble up to a much later date, and the wardenship of the Cinque Ports, then held by Cecil, was a busy post when, as in May 1616, pirate vessels were captured between Broadstairs and Margate. In connection with the trade and commerce of London, fairs and markets held a very important position, but here it will only be possible to make a passing allusion to them. Bartholomew Fair, Smithfield, granted to the Prior of St. Bartholomew's by Henry II, 1133, was for several centuries the great cloth fair of England. Its memory is kept alive by the street which is still known as Cloth Fair. After the dissolution of the monasteries, the fair was annually opened by the mayor, attended by the aldermen. It long outlived its use and reputation, and was not finally abolished until the 19th century had run its course for some years. In the city letter books, there are references to other less important fairs. Thus, a fair then only recently established in Soper Lane, now Queen Street, Cheapside, and known as Nain or Noon Fair, was abolished about 1307 owing to its being the resort of thieves and cutpurses. There was also a fair called La Novelle Fair, which was held in the parish of St. Nicholas Acons. Many fairs were held at different times in Southwark, Westminster, and other places in the neighbourhood of London. How important the great fairs of the Middle Ages were may be seen in one instance among others by the fact that the citizens of London resorted in such numbers to St. Botolph's Fair, annually held at Boston, County Lincoln, on St. Botolph's Day, 17th of June, that all business in the court of Hustings ceased, and the court was closed for a week. In the fourth book of the Liber Albus, there is a list of letters and other documents relating to markets and fairs, several of which relate to St. Botolph's Fair. In Saxon times, buying and selling could only be lawfully carried out before the reeve of Folkmoot, a practice which necessitated a gathering in towns at fixed times, from which custom grew up the practice of each town having a market day. As a rule, this was on a Sunday, and the marketplace was often situated in the churchyard, close beneath the sheltering walls of the parish church. By the Statute Winton, 13 Edward I, fairs and markets were forbidden to be held in churchyards, and the Statute 27 Henry VI was the first enactment intended to enforce a due observance of Sunday. To avoid the scandal of holding fairs and markets on Sundays and upon high feast days, it was decreed that, quote, "fairs and markets shall not be holden on Sundays or on festivals," end quote, with the exception of 4 Sundays in harvest. There is no public right of holding fairs or markets, and the privilege emanates from the prerogative of the Crown. From the earliest times, the streets of London were occupied by the various trades who obtained the privilege of using them as marketplaces. The market of West Cheap or Cheapside was the chief of these public places, but almost all the trades had their appointed stations in the different streets, and in many cases the trades were not allowed to sell their wares in other places than those assigned to them. In the time of Edward I, it was ordered, quote, "that all manner of victuals that are sold by persons in Cheap, upon Cornhill, and elsewhere in the city, such as bread, cheese, poultry, fruit, hides and skins, onions and garlic, and all other small victuals, for sale as well by denizens as by strangers, shall stand midway between the kennels of the streets as to be a nuisance to no one, under pain of forfeiture of the article." End quote. Quote, "The pavement in Cheap," end quote, was a recognized marketplace for corn, probably situated near the church of St. Michael le Quern, at the west end of Cheapside. Stocks Market, which stood on the site of the present Mansion House, was founded in 1283, and the rents were appropriated to the maintenance of London Bridge. In 1324, the wardens of the bridge made complaint that certain fishmongers and butchers had of late abandoned the market house, had erected sheds in the King's Highway and other adjoining places, and sold their flesh and fish there, quote, whereby the rents aforesaid, which formed the greater part of the maintenance of the said bridge, had become immensely reduced to the great peril and damage of the bridge and of the city, and of all passing over such bridge. End quote. Staples were markets where only certain goods called staple goods were allowed to be sold. The Company of Merchants of the Staple had a monopoly of exporting the staple commodities of England, and certain staple towns, which were constantly changed, were appointed as centres of the trade. The chief export was wool, quote, the sovereign treasure, end quote, of England, wherewith she was said to keep the whole world warm. In 1328, and again in 1334, all staples were abolished and trade was free according to the Great Charter. Free trade did not last long, and the staple was fixed at Bruges in 1344. By the Ordinance of Staple 27 Edward III, 1353, 10 staple towns were appointed in England, Wales, and Ireland, Westminster and London together being considered as one of the 10. The staple of Bruges was removed from Bruges to Westminster by this Act. In 1360, part of this Act was repealed. Calais remained a staple till it was temporarily suppressed in 1369, Statute 43 Edward III. By this Act, the staple of wool was in future to be confined to the following English ports: Newcastle, Hull, Boston, Yarmouth, Queenborough, Westminster, Chichester, Winchester, Exeter, and Bristol. The staple towns continued to be changed, and there were great complaints made by the English in Tudor times that the staple was fixed abroad. We read that, quote, the carriage out of wool to the staple is a great hurt to the people of England, though it be profitable both to the prince and to the merchant also. End quote. The changes in the wool trade in England during the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries caused an industrial revolution, the effects of which are well marked in our literature. The raw material was no longer exported, but in its place the cloth made here was sent to countries which had formerly supplied us with cloth in exchange for our wool. In consequence, the number of wealthy merchants increased. With this prosperity the country became proud, and the lawgivers did all they could to foster the manufactures of the country. Footnote: Mr. W. J. Ashley notes that the earliest instance of the prohibition of the export of wool is found in the action of the Oxford Parliament of 1258. The barons then, quote, decreed that wool of the country should be worked up in England and should not be sold to foreigners, and that everyone should use woolen cloth made within the country, end quote. And lest people should be dissatisfied at having to put up with the rough cloth of England, they bade them, quote, not to seek over precious raiment. End quote. English Economic History and Theory, 1888 to 1893. End of footnote. A statute passed in 1463, 3 Edward IV, prohibited by enumeration the import of almost all wrought goods in order that, quote, the English artificers may have employment. End quote. A similar act was passed in the reign of Henry VIII, by which foreign books could only be introduced in sheets, so that work could be provided for the English bookbinders. The famous poem written by Adam de Molyneux, Moleyns or Mollins, Bishop of Chichester and Keeper of the Privy Seal, died 1450, which was entitled The Libel of English Policy, 1437, contains a full account of commodities exchanged between the countries of Western Europe. The full title of this important libellum shows its object. Quote, here beginneth the prologue of the process of the libel of English policy, exhorting all England to keep the sea environ, and namely the narrow sea, showing what profit cometh thereof, and also worship and salvation to England and to all English men. End quote. The leading idea of the little book, as may be seen from the title, is that which agitates the public mind at the present time, and shows how important it is that England should keep the seas and protect the food and clothing coming to this country. In connection with the commerce and trade of the country, the official weighing of goods was a matter of great importance. As far back as the Saxon period, standard weights and measures were preserved in the City of London, and with these the weights and measures throughout the kingdom had to conform. The king's great beam or tron was used for weighing coarse goods by the hundredweight, and the small beam or balance for silks, spiceries, and goods sold by the poundweight. The King's Weigh House in Fish Street Hill, London, and the Tron Church in Edinburgh remind us of the old weighing machines of the country. It was formerly the custom to allow a margin to buyers at the Tron. According to the Liber de Antiquis, in 1305 the weigher allowed the buyer a draft of £4 in every hundredweight. At the present day there is a survival of this custom in the tea trade and some others, for the importer gives a precisely similar draft to the dealer, viz. £1 in every chest of tea of £28. Foreigners and strangers were not permitted, as a rule, to take up their residence within the walls of London for a longer period than 40 days, and were subject to several restrictions as to trade. Exceptions were, however, made from time to time with various foreign towns. Natives of Denmark enjoyed the privilege of sojourning in London all the year through, in addition to which they had a right to all the benefits of, quote, the law of the City of London, end quote. That is, they were entitled to the right of resorting to fair or to market in any place throughout England. Norwegians had the same right of sojourning in London all the year, but did not enjoy, quote, the law of the city, end quote, as they were prohibited from leaving it for the purposes of traffic. In February 1303 the king, by the Carta Mercatoria, granted exceptional privileges to foreign merchants, and these concessions caused great indignation among his subjects at home. A tax was exacted from these foreigners, and in 1309 the Friscobaldi were appointed by the king to receive the new custom, and 2 years later he ordered their arrest for failing to render an account of the money received under that head. Their detention, however, was of short duration. The act was repealed in 1311, and again enacted in 1322. But with the accession of Edward III, it was again repealed. Foreign commerce is said to have been better governed than inland trade, for the king had an arbitrary authority in the regulation of trading. In dealing with the trade of London, it is necessary to say something about the origin of guilds, but this is a most difficult question, respecting which very different opinions are held by writers on the subject. It will be impossible to discuss these points at all fully in this chapter, and therefore a few dates will be found sufficient for the present purpose. Medieval guilds were voluntary associations established for mutual assistance. It is quite easy to show the likeness between them and the Roman collegia, but to do this is futile, because few now believe in any connection between these two institutions. Similar circumstances often cause similar institutions to arise. In the Middle Ages, few men and women could stand alone, and combination was a positive necessity for existence, and the people soon found that union is strength. The great authority on this subject is Mr. Toulmin Smith's work, entitled English Guilds, which was edited by his daughter, Miss Toulmin Smith, and published by the Early English Text Society in 1880. Prefixed to this great work is Dr. Brentano's valuable essay on the history of guilds, in which he writes, quote, I write to declare here most emphatically that I consider England the birthplace of guilds. End quote. Some writers have fixed upon the second half of the 9th century as the date of the origin of guilds, but Miss Toulmin Smith points out that among the laws of Inner, AD 688 to 725, are two touching the liability of the brethren of a guild in the case of slaying a thief. Alfred, AD 871 to 879, still further recognized the brotherly guild spirit in his laws as to manslaughter by a kinless man, and again where a man who has no relatives is slain. Dr. Brentano writes, quote, An already far advanced development of the guilds is shown by the Judicia Civitatis Londoniae, the statutes of the London guilds, which were reduced to writing in the time of King Athelstan. From them, The guilds in and about London appear to have united into one guild, and to have framed common regulations for the better maintenance of peace, for the suppression of violence, especially of theft and the aggressions of the powerful families, as well as for carrying out rigidly the ordinances enacted by the king for that purpose." End quote. A large division of the old guilds were purely social, and there is no trace of merchant guilds before the Norman conquest, while craft guilds did not come into existence until early in the 12th century. Dr. Brentano writes, quote, "Though the merchant guilds consisted chiefly of merchants, yet, from the first, craftsmen, as such, were not excluded from them on principle, if only such craftsmen possessed the full citizenship of the town, which citizenship, with its further development, depended on the possession of estates of a certain value situated within the territory of the town. The strict separation which existed between the merchants and the crafts probably arose only by degrees. Originally, the craftsmen, no doubt, traded in the raw materials which they worked with." End quote. Mr. Ashley is of opinion that Dr. Brentano exaggerated both the independence and the economic importance of the trade guilds. He further writes, quote, "We do not know whether there had ever been a guild merchant in London. However, in 1191, by the recognition of its commune, the citizens obtained complete municipal self-government and, consequently, the recognition of the same right over trade and industry as a guild merchant would have exercised." End quote. Dr. Gross, in his work on the guild merchant, says that he can find no evidence of the existence of a merchant guild in London. Still, there were trade guilds which were aristocratic in origin, and governed by the great merchants who were the chief landowners of London. Mr. C. G. Crump, however, has lately found direct mention of the Guild Merchant of London in 1252 in a charter of that date. Charter Roll 37 Henry III. While pointing out that this was apparently unknown to Dr. Gross, as he decides against the existence of any such institution, he adds, quote, "This charter, while it suggests a doubt on the point, is not conclusive because it is a very exceptional document. There is no other charter of its kind during the whole reign of Henry III, and a chancery clerk endeavouring to draft a charter to convert a Florentine merchant into a citizen of London might well have thought fit to mention a guild merchant as a matter of common form even if none actually existed." End quote. The year 1180 is an important one in the history of guilds, for then these bodies were required to pay their fines or licenses in token and recognition of their allegiance to the crown. There were 18 of these, which were immersed as adulterine guilds, the goldsmiths, the pepperers, and the butchers being among them. The document containing this list is translated by Herbert in his work on the companies, where it is suggested that the fining of these proves that the guilds must have been numerous, because some of them only could have subjected themselves to the penalty. The mercers claim an existence at a still earlier date, 1172, and when the saddlers are mentioned immediately after the conquest, they are said to possess ancient statutes. Gradually, the influence of the craftsmen made itself felt, and the craft guilds came into existence, but the aristocratic traders would not recognize them. The craftsmen found an enthusiastic patron in Thomas Fitz-Thomas, the popular mayor, 1261 to 1265. His conduct disgusted Arnold Fitz-Thedmar, the city alderman and chronicler, who complains that, quote, "This mayor, during the time of his mayoralty, had so pampered the city populace, that styling themselves the commons of the city, they had obtained the first voice in the city. For the mayor, in doing all that he had to do, acted and determined through them, and would say to them, 'Is it your will that so it shall be?' And then, if they answered, 'Ya, ya,' so it was done. And on the other hand, the aldermen or chief citizens were little or not at all consulted on such matter, but were in fact just as though they had not existed." End quote. After the Battle of Evesham, the city was taken into the king's hands, 1265 to 1270, and a very despotic and wicked action was perpetrated. Fitz-Thomas, and some other prominent citizens were summoned to Windsor, and there were kept prisoners. Some of these regained their liberty, but nothing more was heard of FitzThomas, as Dr. Reginald Sharp writes, quote, "From the time that he entered Windsor Castle, he disappears from public view. That he was alive in May 1266, at least in the belief of his fellow citizens, is shown by their cry for the release of him and his companions who are at Windleshaw's." End quote. The craftsman lost a valiant friend, but another was raised up in his place. Walter Hervey, who was hated by the aldermen for his democratic opinions, but loved by the commons, was elected mayor in 1272. Fresh ordinances for the regulation of various crafts were drawn up, and to these the mayor, on his own responsibility, attached the city seal. When his year of office expired, these so-called charters were called in question, and in 1274 they were examined in the hustings before all the people and declared void. The craft guilds were supposed to be defeated, but this was not really so, for the merchants found that the struggle between the trade guilds and the craft guilds was an unequal one. They therefore, with much worldly wisdom, joined the latter, and gradually gained an ascendancy in them. Mr. Ashley affirms that from the reign of Edward II, the guild system was no longer merely tolerated, but it was fostered and extended. The years which followed the Peace of Bretigny, until war broke out afresh in 1369, witnessed the reorganization of many of the trade and craft guilds. In 1376, the guilds wrested for a time from the wards the right of electing members of the city's council. The guilds continued to elect until 1384, when the right of election was again transferred to the wards. The names of the representatives of the guilds forming the first common council of the kind are placed on record in Letterbook H. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. End of Section 19.